Hello boys and girls. Today Auntie Katie is going to read Mr. Tall by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Are you sitting comfy? Mr. Tall by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Tall was very, very, very tall. Quite the tallest person you've ever met. In fact, quite the tallest person you've never met, because you've never met anyone with legs as long as Mr. Tall's legs. Have you? Have you ever met anyone with legs as tall as that? Goes up and he's so tall he has to come back down like this. Now, the problem with being as tall as Mr. Tall meant that life was just one long problem. As you can see, his legs, he can't straighten them in bed. Oh dear, he used to sigh. Oh dear me, I do so wish that my legs weren't quite so very, very, very long. He decided to go for a walk to think over his problem. He was just stepping over a tree when he heard a voice, a little voice. Hello. There's Mr. Tall stepping over a tree. I wonder where the voice is coming from. It was Mr. Small, standing underneath a daisy. But Mr. Tall was so tall he couldn't see him. So Mr. Small shouted at the top of his voice, "Hello!" A Mr. Small shout is about as loud as a bee's sneeze. He's doing his best to get Mr. Tall's attention, Mr. Small. Mr. Small's so small that he fits under a flower. That's small, isn't it? So it took quite some time for Mr. Tall to spot him. "Oh," he said gloomily, "it's you." "You don't look very happy," said Mr. Small. "What's up?" "I am," replied Mr. Tall, "because of these silly long legs of mine." "Oh," said Mr. Small. There's Mr. Tall talking to Mr. Small. He has to bend right down because Mr. Small's so small. Oh, whoopsies. Mr. Small decided to cheer him up. "Let's go for a walk together," he suggested. So they did, which of course didn't work. It was like a giraffe going for a walk with a mouse. Because of the size difference, Mr. Tall is very tall and Mr. Small is very small. Mr. Small barely comes up to his feet. Then Mr. Small had an idea, which did work. Look at him. He's on Mr. Tall's shoulders. That's a good idea, isn't it? Now they can walk at the same speed. And because of the length of Mr. Tall's legs, they very quickly walked all the way to the seaside. "Come for a swim," cried Mr. Small. "Can't," replied Mr. Tall. "By the time it gets deep enough for me to swim, I'll be out the other side." Oh, that is a problem. There they are talking at the seaside. So Mr. Small went for a swim, whilst Mr. Tall sat down with a face which was nearly as long as his legs. Oh, his poor long face, because he can't go for a swim. Look at his legs. Mr. Tickle came along. "Hello," he said. "You look as if you need cheering up. Care for a tickle?" "No, thanks," replied Mr. Tall. "What I would care for are some different legs. Mine are much too long." There's Mr. Tall and Mr. Tickle. I've read Mr. Tickle before. "So are my arms," said Mr. Tickle cheerfully, "but all the better for tickling." And off he went, chuckling, looking for somebody to tickle, looking for anybody to tickle. There's Mr. Tickle chuckling away. Mr. Nosy came along. "Cheer up," he said. "You look very down in the mouth. What's the problem?" "It's my legs," replied Mr. Tall. "They're too long." Oh, there's Mr. Nosy talking to Mr. Tall. I've read him out loud before. "So is my nose," replied Mr. Nosy, laughing, "but all the better for poking into other people's business." And off he went, and he went off looking for something to be nosy about. looking for anything to be nosy about. There's Mr. Nosy, looking for anything to be nosy about. Mr. Greedy came along. "Hello," he cried. "You look gloomy. What's wrong?" "It's my legs," explained Mr. Tall. "They're too big." There's Mr. Tall talking to Mr. Greedy. Wonder what Mr. Greedy's gonna say. Oh, look at that belly. "So's my tummy," replied Mr. Greedy, "but all the better for filling with food." And off he went, licking his lips. There he is, Mr. Greedy and his big belly. Mr. Tall sat there and thought about Mr. Tickle's arms and Mr. Nosy's nose and Mr. Greedy's tummy. He smiled, and then he grinned. And then he laughed out loud. He looked at his legs, those very, very, very long legs of his. All the better for walking, he chuckled, and he walked home in 4 minutes, 40 miles, because his legs are so long. Wowzers. So he's found good use for his long legs after all. Mr. Small came out of the sea after his short swim. And how am I going to get home, he asked himself. So he set off walking all the way home, 40 miles. And that was last year. There's Mr. Small having to walk home. He got home yesterday. Mr. Tall by Roger Hargreaves.